Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, everyone. And thank you for joining this session of the SBC Symposium. As introduced, my name is Nicole Capesi, and it is a privilege to moderate this very timely panel discussion titled Navigating the Funding Crisis, Adapting and Innovating for Sustainable Social and Behavior Change in Africa. This conversation matters because, as we all know, durable behavior change takes time, longer than most grant cycles allow. Yet recent funding cuts have exposed just how fragile our work can be, while also creating opportunities to innovate, localize, and build more resilient systems. So as Billy said, our discussion today follows a very simple arc. We'll start with donor realities and priorities to understand what really drives decisions. We'll then reframe the structural issues in current funding models. And then finally, we'll hear perspectives on sustaining our gains and exploring alternative financing approaches. I'm joined today by 3 speakers, and each speaker will have 7 minutes. As they speak, I invite you, our audience, to use the chat feature to share any reflections or any questions you may have. My colleagues and I will compile these and will address as many as possible during the Q&A at the end. It is now my honor to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Stephanie Thorland from the Global Alliance for SBC. Stephanie has led global partnerships and resource mobilization for SBC, and she brings deep insight into donor thinking. She will speak on donor perspectives, talking to us about some of the current priorities, what they are, what are some of the decision drivers, and the future of SBC funding. Stephanie will help us understand what issues donors are now prioritizing, how they decide what gets funded, and importantly, what good SBC looks like from a donor lens. Stephanie, welcome. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Thorland, and I will say up front, yes, I don't work for a donor and I don't have a crystal ball. But yes, earlier this year, following the closure of USAID and major funding reductions from other donors, a group of us in the Global Alliance for SBC conducted a donor landscape review. We all know that USAID played an outsized role in funding SBC, and we wanted to assess our prospects as a sector looking forward. As Adebayo said, we have suffered from a dependency syndrome, and Ali's encouragement of a decolonized mindset and Alan's emphasis of being your own savior are essential today. But that said, I'm here to speak about the donors. So across a couple of dozen donors, 10 priority issue areas relevant to SBC emerged. The capacity of several of these donors is now diminished, including most of the UN agencies, but their priorities remain relevant, so we included them. These priority themes, 10 of them, are health and health system strengthening, climate change, nutrition, agriculture, democracy and governance and peace building, risk communication and community engagement, gender issues, including work on gender norms and gender equality, family planning, neglected tropical diseases and WASH, and child rights and health. Now, why are these the priorities now? Food and health are universal human needs that must be supported. Donors are going to keep showing up for them. These also relate to complex national scale systems to be built and refined in many countries. They are also tied to increasing GDP and boosting the economy. And in our capitalist and increasingly conservative world, these factors will continue to attract attention and investment. Also, climate change is a universal threat, which is almost universally agreed upon. This includes natural disasters and disease outbreaks that are realities we must prepare for as well. The Scandinavian donors in particular are actively acknowledging that these threats are larger for poor, low-resource populations and regions, and this is showing up in their strategies. For gender-related issues, support for marginalized groups, and democracy efforts, some politically progressive donor countries are trying to fill in where the US and others have removed substantial funding. And some donors remain dedicated to more specialty issues like family planning and NTDs. So the question now facing us is, how will they decide what SBC to fund? And I have to be blunt and say, I don't think that they will fund SBC per se. Rather, they will fund projects that show clearly how a package of interventions will lead to measurable achievement of the donor's objectives. That remains the same. We must be sure that SBC is integrated throughout and across those project pieces. Now, that's for larger scale projects, and we must also think in smaller scale. My colleague Sarah Jewett will be speaking more on that. So, what would good SBC look like to donors now? And I've got 2 points on this. One leans more into SBC and what we know and love in our language and how we speak, and one leans more away from it. And I'll explain more about each. So, leaning into SBC, how SBC should be positioned to attract more investment? I think we need to try to acknowledge upfront the long-term pace and stages of behavior change by promising outcomes that are tiered according to the stages of behavior change for the midpoint and final evaluations, so that donors can see clearly how adoption of those target objectives increases with time and according to and moving across these stages. And also that with continued investment and time, these impacts will increase. You should have a reasonable plan for what that continued investment strategy would need to include to fully achieve the goal too. Now, leaning away from SBC is really where you see opportunities to localize, integrate, and innovate, and not necessarily design an SBC project, but in terms of localizing, really focusing on strengthening local capacity so that communities and institutions own the work, or locally specific resilience and climate change adaptation strategies that are very specific. On the integration, this is really the thinking that SBC shouldn't be considered a standalone strategy. It is a set of tools to apply to a project and a problem. Combining it with commodities, capacity building, and/or services makes a compelling solution. We should consider SBC as able to contribute across every building block of a system. It is a powerful set of tools, and this applies to health systems and others. We need to embed SBC in these systems and programs. As Kara Tereski, formerly of FHI 360 and now running her own consulting, recently said, we need a shift from short-term wins to long-term systems gains. On the final point of that, innovate, this applies to both our programming and our business development efforts. We need to develop or elevate low-cost, horizontal, holistic, integrated approaches. This includes community-centered responses to crises that are low cost. We need to bring SBC into some new focus areas where it hasn't been as utilized, such as anti-corruption, democracy, and governance. We need to connect with the behavioral insights and science realm in a more intentional and less competitive way. And on business development, we do need to diversify SBC funding, considering less conventional donors. This includes CSR, wealthy individuals and diaspora, impact investment funds. The constraints and decision-making criteria of donors right now. There's 3 points here that I'll conclude with. As we all know, SBC is typically seen as a nice to have, and so is usually the first to be cut when compared with services, commodities, humanitarian response efforts. Now more than ever, we must be more than just messaging and more than a campaign. We must integrate, apply systems thinking, and convincingly connect the dots between several elements of a multi-pronged approach that has SBC integrated throughout it. Make clear to donors why this combination produces those measurable, attributable results that lead to those intended outcomes. This will sell. Funds and budgets are now reduced and unreliable due to conservative politics and power in many places. The expectation now is that countries and NGOs and SBC must do more with less. Always a fun challenge. So this means we must design for high return on investment and really ensure attribution of results back to our work. And we have to drop bells and whistles from how we might ideally be developing projects and interventions. Really focus on what's driving the outcomes that you're promising. And lastly, conservative politics holding power sadly means that less policy and funding exists that actively cares about humans, about children, about marginalized groups. This is the reality. So if these are your missions and your focus areas, you really must build relationships with donors that hold those same values. Building coalitions with like-minded organizations is how we will continue to move on these issues and priorities. Do not take a competitive mindset with your fellow resistance fighters, but find ways to be stronger together. That concludes my talk.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that candid look at, donor priorities, laying them out for us, and just the reminder that SBC needs to be more than what it is today, more than messaging, a stark reminder that it must be embedded into our systems to be seen as essential. So thank you very much, Stephanie. Our second speaker is Dr. Sarah Jewett. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand and a recognized leader in SBC capacity strengthening. Dr. Sarah will speak on the structural issues and how we can rethink SBC funding models to unlock sustainable impact. She'll unpack how traditional funding models have undermined long-term change and share lessons and innovative approaches to bridge the gap between donor realities and sustainable SBC. Dr. Sarah, over to you. And I understand that we are now able to share video and unmute. So if you're in a position to, please turn your video on. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Nicole. All those things I've been asked to do in 7 minutes, I'll try. But thank you to all who have joined. I see a great number of people, colleagues and friends. It's overwhelming and honor to be asked to look at this question. And the question really I was asked to look at was around the structure of financing to begin with, and to see what lessons we can take as we build off of what we've already heard from Prof. Ali Alni, Alan, and Stephanie, and others who have been contributing. So in terms of structure, we've already heard from our opening remarks by Prof. Adebayo and others that though the most recent funding cuts have been dramatic, unprecedented, both in scale and speed, there have been problems in the aid architecture for social and behavior change for a long time. And in thinking about that, I would like to highlight 4 key elements about that structure that I think we need to reflect on, as there are still funding mechanisms that might continue to mirror some of these problems. So as we're looking forward and taking to heart the need for adaptation, the need for diversification and all of that, I do want to highlight sort of 4 hallmarks of what has been problematic beyond just the basic dependency. And one of those things has been the fact that a lot of the funding up till now has been very large budget and project-based. The 3-year funding for a 5-year project for a 20-year problem, as the joke used to go. Those projects have, in their nature, forced us to oftentimes step away from the local contexts because of their size and scale, and also step away from ways of relating to communities, being respectful of community processes or knowledges, just because of their size. Also, because of the size and complexity, what has happened is that many of these projects have been managed by very technically able organizations, but organizations and leadership that has not been based in our countries, and certainly not the communities in which many of our projects have worked. And what that has meant is a disconnect when projects ended of not having to face those you're walking away from. And I think we cannot undermine the importance of relationship and trust in these cycles of projects, the projectization of change processes. So I think that's a key thing to just consider as we talk about the importance of relationships. Also, the kind of funding mechanisms that we were introduced to ended up, because of the economies, a whole industry. ended up creating a distorted human resource population where many of our greatest talents were taken on board in these projects as program managers and doing wonderful things. But now with the removal of those funding sources, those same people, many who are on this call, are finding it difficult to find something similar to which they can pivot because it's just that industry is changed. And then finally, because of the dynamics of projects, what has happened over the years is a lot of competition between actors who historically may have worked together, where they were fighting for the same kind of resources. And so that has, over time again, created a dynamic of distrust and broken down what might have been more locally relevant kind of ground up movements. So I've been asked to look at this in the context of what can we look for in terms of sustainable impact? And when I think of sustainable SBC impact, I'm not talking about the sustaining of our projects, but actually the sustaining or resilience of the work that we do. And this really goes to the heart of what Alan was saying. Like, let's just be real. What are you doing? What value are you adding? Can we be real about that? And so about 13 years ago, I was part of a process where we looked at organizations who had had funding cuts. And we looked at how they were doing a couple of years later. And there were three key insights, and you're going to hear echoes of what people have already talked about, but there were three key insights in what helped people not only survive, limp along, but really thrive post those funding cuts. And the first was mindset. So Prof. Ali Aouni already mentioned this, an adaptive mindset, where from the get-go organizations recognized funding and dependency, it was all very temporary. That mindset was one which really sought to invest in relationships, in building those stories that Alan was talking about, in building systems, and not just building individual capacities, but organizational capacities, instead of going just to scale or creating salary structures that couldn't be sustained once that funding was gone. So those were the organizations that really were able to continue after funding cuts. And so that mindset shift, I think, is really critical. Another thing that was common across those that were thriving was their ability to tell their story. And part of that story was the kind of stories Alan's talking about, the story of the person, the impact, but also those organizations understood that there are different stories needed for different people in our ecosystems. So governments needed to know that what you were doing was cost effective, it could be integrated within existing systems and so on. A community needed to know that you were going to be there through thick and thin. Donors needed to know that you had the ability to meet their indicators and their agendas, as well as anything else you might want to be doing. So that was key. So having a clear story or a clear value proposition. And the final thing was where they were anchored. Organizations that were anchored on the donor and adapting to whatever the donor's agenda was, a lot of them shut their doors. Those who were anchored in community and clear value, a clear agenda, are those that were thriving and continued to find ways, creative ways, to maintain their impact. And I'm not, again, talking about just jobs, but impact, being able to do what they did best, because that is where their hearts were. So I think those three things are key. Again, I'm just going to restate the adaptive mindset, the ability to tell a clear story about what you're doing, what you're about, and that can be evidence, it can be M&E, but it also is stories, and then anchoring the agenda and the organization on that local community. So with my last minute or so, just a few things to think about as we think about the context that we're in and where we can invest, and different strategies we can use as we look for different types of funding. I think core is keeping at heart what we're doing and what is valuable to that. But different resource mobilization tactics need to be revisited and maybe re-anchored. And I know the next speaker will speak to this too, but a few thoughts I've had are, as we look local, national, or regional, we need to also acknowledge that we're not the only ones who have had funding cuts. So we should be using our skills in social and behavior change and communication to work together with partners to advocate to reduce, for instance, the fixed cost of medication, to ensure that if we can cut down costs on those things, that they can also invest more resources for us, for the SBC work that we do. So this could be through things like pooled procurement or social mobilization, like we did in South Africa with the Treatment Action Campaign. These are things we know how to do, and we need to go back to that. We also need to mobilize more grassroots responses. This includes our faith communities and others. We need to do if communities are going to invest in us, it's because they value what we do. If what we were doing was not valued, it was seen as a project, they're not going to invest in us. So let's focus on those things and find where we connect. And those partners can be government, they can be donors, but they can also be your local community members, the religious communities, and so on. We also have huge diasporas. The aid coming into Africa from our diasporas are far, far greater than any donor agencies ever have been. We need to be talking about what value we bring to the communities which they have left and where they still have connections. Engaging in not just multinationals and other businesses which have their own agendas, but also local businesses who have a vested interest in their communities thriving is really important. And finally, I think others have already said this, but aligning more closely with our government service delivery agendas and others to make sure that we are integral to that. And they see, and we make the point of how we add value there is essential. So I'm going to end by just saying that this is an opportunity for us to break down our learned dependencies and rethink power dynamics in a way that we step away from maybe where we've leaned too heavily on some relationships and priorities at the expense of others, to reset those priorities and really invest in our relationships with each other. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. Rethinking our learned dependencies was something that struck out for me. But thank you so much for challenging us, one, to rethink not just where the resources come from, but how we as a community anchor ourselves in adaptive mindsets, clear value propositions, and of course, strong relationships. So thank you so much for that. Our final speaker is Nana Agyei. He is the CEO of Blackstar Brokerage, and he brings a valuable perspective from the private sector, where his work has focused on building sustainable partnerships and innovative financing solutions. So today, Nana will share insights on adaptive strategies and alternative financing for development. He'll explore what lessons we as the SBC community can borrow from private sector approaches and how we might blend diverse funding sources, and what bold new models could help us sustain our gains well beyond donor cycles. Welcome, Nana. You can also, I think, access your video. So if you could switch it on for us, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and maximum respect to Stephanie and Sarah, my panelists. And it's been a very insightful session. I still remember and have the reflection of Prof. Ali's idea about mindset. Kindly confirm for me if you can hear me, and with your indulgence, I will share a slide that I'd like to run my presentation through.
We can hear. Please carry on.
Great. And please confirm if you can see my slide.
We can see your slide. Thank you.
Great. So I think the foundation has been set very well. And I think the whole concept is to talk about how we can adapt strategies that will let development. In this context, I'm referring a lot more to development, but it's also focusing on SBC, but to a larger extent on general development, looking at how we can do things through markets, or diaspora capital, and issues of realigning policy innovations. The tenets, we need to agree that, for instance, this contest is referred to Africa. And when it comes to Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, we've been through this before on the macroeconomic level and the general economic level. We've been through this stage before. In the 80s all the way to the early 2000s, we were in the era that on the sovereign level, we were getting grants, we were getting free aids and all that, to the point that we migrated to the point where we needed to be on our own and also have our own funding. So we've moved from the point where in states like Ghana, we had over 30 sub-Saharan African countries getting HIPIC support and all others. Then we moved to the era where economies needed to borrow on their own, where economies needed to get their own funding. And like the quote says, when the aid was shrinking and when the aid was cut, states needed to be resilient, and they did that through innovation. The story has not been all that glossy. It is not the all positive story. There have been some pluses and minuses to this approach, but here's the thing: countries after aid cuts decided to move on by borrowing and using other approaches. Later on in my presentation, I will talk about those ones as well. Then the other, I call these painful facts, because even organizations like UN are being affected by the aid cuts, because you have the key champions of aid like US and EU realigning, and also, for want of a better expression, and major organizations were also affected by funding aid, not necessarily maybe the poor lady in Malawi who may be benefiting from it, but these are realigning of these things. So when these aids were cut to the sovereigns, they realigned by financing their budget deficits by going into markets. And in the mid-2000s, you have countries like Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, even going to the extent of borrowing from the international capital market. And this has been touched on, so I don't need to speak a lot more about it. But the key thing here is, I'm using Ghana as an example, but this is a similar example for even the entire sub-Saharan Africa. The percentage of aid as a proportion of the revenue we organize locally is not very significant. It's way below 5%. But here's the catch: it's because of how targeted these aids were and how they were structured. That's why you have about 2% of something being cut, but you feel the aid. So this particular point, I would like to re-emphasize it, that there is a potential, there is a capacity, because what 2% was doing, if it's cut and we can feel it, then it means that if we realign, if we restructure, strategize, and if we adapt properly, we can make good out of the situation, and we wouldn't necessarily be suffering from decision from other parties. So how do we go from here? The key thing is, we are encouraging that we don't have to ignore the sovereign template. The sovereign template, I mean, where countries that were getting aid, the likes of Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, when the aids were cut, their template was they have to find their way around. Apart from their own revenues, they moved into markets to borrow and all that. The other thing is philanthropy has evolved from many stages, and currently we are talking about impact investing. So these are things we need to pay attention to. We also have to talk about the realignment of state-led programs, which I'll touch on briefly in my presentation. And for development agents like SBC and related parties, I think the level of advocacy has to be taken to a different level, because now it's not going to be aid or the modes of funding have been cut. Then my last point is we either adapt or we die. This particular slide is talking about the areas that we can look at and push. So it's not necessarily the agencies like SBC going to necessarily do this, but the advocacy and the push and the lobbying will be towards these areas. So you have issues of municipals and parastatals issuing their own investment asset to undertake certain development projects in areas of education, health, ICT, and so on. You also have securitization of earmarked funds, and this is also the same, where you have, by virtue of state laws and state regulations, certain funds are earmarked for certain purposes. How do you securitize them so that you can have the impact, you can have the development ahead of time? There's also the bit about green and sustainability, and currently these are popular themes because we all want to leave the world, even not as we met it, in a better state, so that the people who come after us would also. And the very key thing, which I think Sarah and Stephanie even touched on, is the diaspora resources. And these things can be re-engineered and remanufactured. These things can be remanufactured and re-engineered into diaspora bonds and funds. Then there's a bit about the hybrid allocation of resources. So you have people who are into philanthropy, people who are also into financing these things. The likes of the Gates Foundation and all that, they have their own foundation, but then the lobbying should be going to the point that there will be a lobby to let them redirect or reassign some of these things into the areas that we push for. So this particular slide is just giving some examples. The fact that a municipal or a parastatal can also make issuances. So there is a Ghana example. This was to fund educational infrastructure, but these monies were coming from state levies. So the concept was to issue bonds in anticipation of these receivables that will come from the state to take care of it. So there is an opportunity for agents like this to lobby for ring-fencing of certain development funds so that it can be directed into certain purposes. For instance, if there are levies in Kenya for health, these ones, because they take a longer time to manifest or to hit accounts and have impact, there can be special purpose vehicles that will be set up by the state. And this is state and private sector partnership to raise capital ahead of time to execute these. Then when the funding comes in, it will be used to finance these development agenda. And there's also the bit of securitization. This is also similar to the same concept I spoke about. This is the case where expected revenues, expected income are used ahead of time so that you use it to develop. Then the very interesting one, the bit about the green financing, the green bonds and all that. There's been examples in Kenya and South Africa that they use. The idea here is to push for a lot more advocacy so that the development partners will lobby these state entities, partner private sector, to allocate these fundings and adopt these strategies so that we can have the impact ahead of time. There is also the realignment of the state policies and state programs. And I have a simple example. In Ghana, there's what we call MASLOC. MASLOC is what can be likened to SBA in the US. It's a state-sponsored small business financing project. And these state-sponsored projects are used to give out loans to individuals and small businesses. However, because these are state-run, they end up becoming politicized. You can depoliticize these projects by doing wholesale lending to microfinance entities. Locally here, we call them rural and community banks or savings and loans. Then they will on-lend to the key beneficiaries, the people down there. And by so doing, the impact will be felt. There's also a Development Bank Ghana initiative here, which were also supported by funding partners like the KFW, the AFDB, and all that. The whole idea is to push down to the development sectors of the economy so that there can be impact. The point I'm making here is we can make a lot of our lobby and advocacy into these things. And I know there are examples of this even in Nigeria. There's Development Bank Nigeria. There's also the Rwandan BRD. And more importantly, the Mudra project in Kenya, which is very key and very critical. Then the diaspora funds. Usually diaspora remittances come for consumption. People are trying to build homes. People are supporting families, which is a key thing, which is also supported. But there is the potential there to lobby people in the diaspora to redirect these resources and also allocate a portion of these resources into projects that will have impact. So you can talk of housing and all that. There have been some examples in Ethiopia and there have been some examples in Nigeria that we can lobby and have people adapt. The way forward, which is a summary of all that I've spoken about, it's just so I don't spend much of my time, is let's have blended approach, and philanthropy has evolved. So people in this sector, SBC and the likes, you're very familiar with people who are into this. Can the lobby be for them to look at impact investing or moving funds into these market-driven solutions so that even when the funds are being cut, because these are more like commercial, so to say, there'll be motivation. So it's a lot more about partnership, high-level partnership, and it should be outcome-based to measure the impacts that will come from thereon. So the call to action is, it's been made from the previous speakers. It is obvious that we have to move from the grant dependency because the grants are no more coming. And if that is what is the way forward, we've done it before. During COVID, there was that level of urgency, sense of urgency, and it looks like it pushed innovation, it pushed for everybody to survive. My caution here is in these suggestions that we are making, the potential counterparties are not like your typical funding partners. These are counterparties that may have commercial and inspiration. So if that is what we are doing, we should be sure that the impact or the purpose is a solid one, that people will be happy that they contributed to such an impact. So the pattern word is let's adapt or die. The areas we seek to improve are ever growing. The need is not stopping. We cannot stick to one way financing or one way approach. So this is the call to action for my presentation. Thank you very much, Nicole, and apologies about the background voice.
Thank you so much, Nana, and for your presentation. Thank you for reminding us that clearly sustainability sometimes requires us to look outside of our usual lanes and to tap into new partners, new markets, and new models. So thank you so much, Nana. We have been collecting a lot of questions through the chat. I do not think we will be able to get to all of them given the time. So I will pose a question each for our panelists, and then the rest of the questions will be shared with them, and they will, be able to respond to those through their LinkedIns and, or through the ASSBC page. So please follow them and or connect with them on there, and you'll be able to see some responses to some of your questions. So I will just start with this first question, and the question goes to Stephanie. So Stephanie, we have a question here that says, how do we work with new and younger behavioral insights, private sector partners who just now are discovering that individual level approaches are not sufficient to generate change, and that small scale model programs may not work at scale? How can we ensure that our hard lessons learned in SBC translates to the new generation of programmers? Thank you.
Love the simple, straightforward questions. Thank you. I think what we want to keep in mind is, in order to connect with other sectors, this younger behavioral insights sector, I would go more in the direction of roundtables and bringing donors in and trying to find that common understanding of what we have to each contribute in order to achieve those outcomes, so that we break down that competitive mindset. We all come together and look at the shared goals and really try to build a container for recognizing that we all have important contributions to make to that, and that there is no one solution, there is no one sector to fix it, to remedy it, to advance it. Yeah, I would go in and really just trying to create those spaces for discussion and connection and collaboration.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Like I said earlier, we'll be sending through the other questions that we'll post for you, and we hope you'll be able to interact with us via your LinkedIn. So the next question is for Dr. Sarah. So Dr. Sarah, we have a question here that says, in the context of shrinking budgets for SBC initiatives across African regions and reprioritizing resources to service delivery, how might we operationalize nudge theory and prospect theory within hybrid models that fuse Western behavioral economics with indigenous knowledge systems? Example, the Ubuntu-based communal decision-making to enhance intervention cost efficiency and cultural resonance while minimizing reliance on other incentives. Thank you.
Thanks. Another really straightforward question. There's a lot packed in there. And I think to answer questions like that, it's really important to, first of all, determine who we means. Like in that conversation, when you think about who is the we that goes into those conversations, I think that is a starting point. And to locate your position and your view of change within that. Then I mean, I think we have a number of tools, going to what Stephanie just mentioned. There's a lot of different perspectives and tools that if we come together and bring them together can be really useful, and they may or may not help in a context. But I think in the context that we're in, we really do need to come with an open and listening ear to understand what's going on in any given context, to determine whether or not nudge or any of these other prospect theory and Ubuntu, all that, how that works. And I think, again, where I would say the starting point is in trying to answer those questions is the starting point of any social and behavior change process, which is really your contextual analysis and spending time with the people who you want to work with and who you're working for to understand where they're coming from. And if there is a heart of sort of collective identity, Ubuntu, and those things that you've just mentioned, I mean, that's really important to honor and understand, and then think about how other perspectives or tools or strategies might feed into that. So it's not a, that, you know, it would depend on the context. I'm going to be a social scientist here, but it's clear to me from your question, you've been doing a lot of deep reading and thinking, which is really encouraging. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. And our final question is for Nana. So Nana, here, the question is, private sector partners often look for, clear returns on investment. How can SBC frame its value in ways that resonate with business priorities? And from your experience, what mindset shift do we as SBC practitioners or development practitioners need in order to engage effectively with the private sector?
Thanks, Nicole. That's a double-headed question. And yes, so I'll take it from the investors' point first to the mindset shift. Let me touch on the mindset shift, which is very key. I think Prof. Lee touched on that at the introductory part of this session, that it should be from a mindset perspective. So it is not necessarily about funding cuts or sources of funding. It is about the can-do. It is about I can do it myself. It is about I can do it from my own resources. So I think that is the mindset we all have to work on, even from the work of development partners like SBC, that we should encourage people to do that. Again, with respect to, and I think I made that caution that in this shift to these funding options, the investors are not necessarily saints. However, in the current scheme of things, investors are proud to indicate their impact stories. No matter how commercially oriented they are, they want to make mention of the life they've touched, the impact they've made in certain areas of life. So these points are there from the private sector people, but there are investors who are first and foremost motivated by impact. So their focus should be on impact investors. Then we can build upon that. Nicole, I hope this answers the question.
Thank you so much, Nana, and still more questions coming in. So we'll share those with you and the rest of the panelists. I would like to thank all the panelists, our speakers. Thank you to the audience for engaging with this conversation. For me, I think 3 themes stood out for me. It's important to kind of be aligned, which, have the transparency, donor transparency and alignment, which will help us position SBC more effectively. Our funding models need to evolve. Short cycles and siloed budgets can't deliver the durable change that we desire. And clearly new solutions are possible, from local businesses to diaspora funding, and to some of, all the innovative things we heard Nana speak of, to innovative partnerships as well. So thank you very much to the three of you. Thank you for allowing me to moderate this very timely discussion. And on that note, let's continue to think boldly and change our mindsets about how we can sustain SBC in Africa.